Here's the brief news from the world over this week. Jihad has come to Paris. France and the world is in mourning, and the manhunt is on for the two killers after Wednesday's Charlie Hebdo attacks. French intelligence has identified the suspects as brothers Sharif and Saeed Kawachi. The former is a convicted terrorist for his involvement in a network that sent radicalized fighters to Iraq. The satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo had long been subject to grave threats for their insulting depictions and negative commentary of Islam as well as the Prophet Muhammad. At the Charlie Hebdo offices, the masked gunman first shot and killed the paper's editor, Stéphane Charbonnier, and his police bodyguard. They shouted Allahu Akbar as they fired. The men then called out the names of other specific employees. 9 journalists, 2 police officers, and a maintenance worker were killed. 11 more were wounded. The Associated Press reports that as many as 8 have been arrested in connection with the attack. On Thursday, a Parisian police officer was shot. Authorities have labeled that killing as a terror attack as well. The lights of the Eiffel Tower were dimmed in remembrance of all the victims on Thursday night. Wednesday's attack has been universally condemned by world leaders, Pope Francis among them. He said during his Thursday morning homily that the Paris attack reminds him of so much human cruelty, so much terrorism, both isolated incidents of terrorism and state-sponsored terrorism. What great cruelty man is capable of, the Pope said. He begged prayers for the victims and for the perpetrators, that they might have a change of heart. And the Paris terrorist attack is likely to escalate an already intense debate over the growth of Islam in Germany. 2 days prior to the incident in France, thousands of Germans took to the streets demonstrating in Berlin and several other cities against the country's immigration policy, which marchers described as an ongoing Islamatization of the West. The protest group released a statement saying that society should give people a chance to integrate, but we should not allow ourselves to be Islamized, thereby losing our freedom and democracy. The Muslim population in Germany is about 4 million and growing due to Germany's fairly open policy for asylum seekers. Thousands of others counter-demonstrated on Monday, among them representatives of the Archdiocese of Cologne. During anti-Islamic protests outside Cologne's landmark cathedral, the lights of the cathedral were dimmed. Cathedral Provost Father Norbert Feldhoff said that anyone who calls himself a Christian would have nothing to do with this movement, and protests would certainly not take place in the light of the cathedral. Back in Washington, the new Congress was installed on Tuesday as Republicans assumed full control on Capitol Hill for the first time in 8 years. With the fall of Vice President Joe Biden's gavel, Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky became majority leader. On the other side of the Capitol, John Boehner was elected to a 3rd term as Speaker of the House. An attempt by a handful of conservative Republicans to replace Boehner fell short of the needed votes. Boehner said on Wednesday that the new Congress had a lot of work to do, and the GOP is committed to addressing America's economic priorities. And with the Iowa caucuses just a year away, several potential Republican presidential candidates are beginning to stir, or at least exploring the idea of stirring. 2012 winner of the Iowa caucuses, Rick Santorum, is among them. A Roman Catholic, the former Pennsylvania senator, told Bloomberg Television this week that he's looking forward to a 2016 campaign that will unite Republicans and bring along a few Democrats. Santorum appears serious about a potential run. CNN reported that he summoned more than 24 former aides and colleagues to Washington for a private briefing regarding his plans for 2016. And former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, another Catholic, had a busy week. After recently declaring his exploratory intentions, Bush this week launched a political committee and a super PAC. He also held his first fundraiser and even waded into the gay marriage debate. When asked about a Florida judge's ruling on Monday allowing same-sex couples to marry, Jeb Bush said the decision should be respected and that marriage is a state issue. He did not elaborate further. Previously, Bush had indicated support for a federal constitutional amendment defining marriage as exclusively between one man and one woman. Meanwhile, former Arkansas governor and 2008 presidential candidate Mike Huckabee ended his weekly Fox News TV show so that he, too, could consider a presidential run. And former New York Governor Mario Cuomo, the liberal icon who flirted with a presidential run in 1992, was laid to rest on Tuesday. The 82-year-old died from heart failure on New Year's Day. During his terms as governor, during the 80s and 90s, Cuomo became the standard-bearer for liberal Democrats and social justice-minded Catholics. But it was a 1984 speech, one that he delivered at the University of Notre Dame, that will perhaps be his enduring political legacy. In the speech, he suggested that the protection of the unborn was not something Catholics necessarily needed to consider in the voting booth, on the legislative floor, or in the judges' chambers. He said, in short, quote, the approval or rejection of legal restrictions on abortion should not be the exclusive litmus test of Catholic loyalty, end quote. Cuomo was also the first public official to identify himself as personally pro-life, claiming that to impose his religious beliefs on non-believers would violate constitutional principles. The bishops of the U.S. have always insisted that protection of human life was an obligation for Catholics in public life, at the voting booth, and in their daily lives. May Mario Cuomo rest in peace. Meanwhile, in Cuba, the dissident group Ladies in White staged their first protest of the new year. In Havana on Sunday, the group again demanded the release of political prisoners and improved human rights. The group's leader, Bertha Soler, said that they were discouraged by the establishment of a U.S. embassy and the promise of renewed ties between the U.S. and the government of Cuba. Soler implied that President Obama was naive for believing that this would favor the Cuban people. Everything, she said, that comes out of this will benefit the Cuban government. Soler added that the Cuban freedom depends on the people, not on other governments. And the beleaguered Christian population in Egypt received an unexpected Christmas greeting on Tuesday as the Coptic Church celebrated the birth of Christ. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi made a surprise visit to Cairo's main Coptic cathedral for midnight mass. Sisi, who led the 2013 military ouster of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi, was greeted with rapturous cheers. In a short speech, he declared that Egypt's Christians and Muslims are one entity in the world's eyes. And, quote, let no one ask what kind of Egyptian you are. It is not right. We must only be Egyptians, end quote. The minority Christian population had become a frequent target of persecution during Morsi's reign. The violence has continued to some extent. Earlier Tuesday, 2 policemen standing guard at a Catholic church in the Upper Nile were shot and killed. On Sunday, Pope Francis announced the latest batch of prelates who will soon become cardinals. And like those elevated last year, most are from the peripheries of the global church. Among the nations represented, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Thailand, Uruguay, Vietnam, and the island nations of Cape Verde in the Atlantic and Tonga in the Pacific. 20 in all were named. 15 are eligible to vote in the next conclave and under 80. A few prelates of note: Cardinal Raymond Burke's replacement at the helm of the Apostolic Signatura, Archbishop Dominique Mamberti, will be among those receiving a red hat, as will the only native English-speaking prelate in the bunch, Archbishop John Atcherley Dew of New Zealand. Archbishop Dew was an outspoken advocate for allowing divorced and remarried Catholics to receive Holy Communion at the Vatican Synod of Bishops in 2005. No new U.S. cardinals were named. Prior to Pope Francis, the U.S. had been represented in every consistory of new cardinals since 1983. In all, Pope Francis has appointed 31 voting-aged cardinals. That's just 1/4 of the 125 now eligible to decide who will be the next successor of Peter. The ceremony for new Cardinals will be held on February 14th. EWTN will be there with live coverage. And finally, in my hometown in New Orleans on Thursday, a mass of thanksgiving was offered at the National Shrine of Our Lady of Prompt Succor in honor of the 200th anniversary of the U.S. victory in the Battle of New Orleans. It was the last major victory of the War of 1812. History tells us while the men went to battle, the women of New Orleans went to pray with the Ursuline nuns at their French Quarter convent. A prayer vigil was kept to Our Lady of Prompt Succor on the eve of the battle. Then at dawn mass, during communion, a messenger burst into the chapel to announce, "Victory is ours." The American victory was considered a miracle as their forces were outnumbered by a large, well-trained British army. Many, including General Andrew Jackson, attributed the unlikely victory to the power of prayer. The Ursulines have kept their promise of a mass of thanksgiving to Our Lady of Prompt Succor every year since.